January 22nd, 1945. Hill 170, Kangor, Burma. Lieutenant Colonel Simon Trevor of No. 1 Commando held his M1 Garand rifle close, watching the jungle tree line through the pre-dawn darkness. Around him, 24 men waited in forward positions on the northern slope. Every man in his unit carried the same American semi-automatic rifle, a weapon that had arrived with them from North Africa 2 years earlier. A weapon most British units had never seen. Trevor did not yet know that in 90 minutes, 300 Japanese soldiers would launch a suicidal assault directly at his position. He did not know that his small force would face odds of more than 12 to 1. What he did know, what every man in his command understood with absolute certainty, was that their American rifles gave them a firepower advantage that would mean the difference between survival and annihilation. The metallic click of a bolt being drawn back echoed through the morning mist. But this was not the familiar sound of a Lee Enfield, the weapon carried by 98% of British infantry in World War II. This was different. Smoother, faster, deadlier. In the hands of a trained rifleman, an M1 Garand could fire 24 aimed rounds per minute. The British Lee Enfield, already the fastest bolt-action rifle ever produced, managed 15 rounds in the same time under optimal conditions. The mathematics told a stark story. A single American rifleman with an M1 Garand could match the sustained firepower of 1.6 British riflemen with Lee Enfields. 3 British soldiers with bolt-action rifles, firing as fast as humanly possible, could barely exceed what one American with a Garand delivered with mechanical reliability. This disparity in firepower would soon become one of the most profound tactical advantages of World War II, a difference measured not in inches or pounds, but in lives saved and battles won. Yet the story of how America fielded the only standard-issue semi-automatic rifle of any major power begins not on battlefields, but in the workshop of a Canadian immigrant who would change warfare forever. January 1st, 1888. St. Remy, Quebec, Canada. John Cantius Garand entered the world on a small farm 17 miles south of Montreal. Nothing about his early life suggested he would one day create the weapon General George Patton would call the greatest battle implement ever devised. At age 11, young Gene, as he was then called, moved with his family to rural Connecticut when his father abandoned farming for textile mill work. By 12, John was sweeping floors in a mill at Jewett City. But the boy was fascinated by the machinery around him. During breaks, he studied the mechanical looms, the steam engines, the precision gears that transformed raw cotton into finished cloth. By age 18, Garand worked as a machinist. His natural aptitude led him to tool and gauge making, skills that required both mathematical precision and artistic intuition. He took correspondence courses at night, teaching himself engineering principles that most men learned only in universities. In 1916, at 28 years old, Garand turned his attention to firearms design. He submitted plans for a semi-automatic rifle to the United States Navy 2 years later. The Navy was impressed enough to request he continue his work at the Bureau of Standards in Washington. After a year and a half, Springfield Armory in Massachusetts offered him a position as a design engineer. What Garand found at Springfield shocked him. The legendary armory, which had given its name to the Springfield rifles that equipped American forces in World War I, was hopelessly outdated. During the Great War, Springfield had produced only 265,000 rifles, nowhere near enough for an army that grew from 200,000 to 4 million men. Another 47,000 came from Rock Island Arsenal. The shortfall forced America to arm hundreds of thousands of soldiers with British Enfield rifles manufactured under license by Remington and Winchester. The Springfield Model 1903 was a superb rifle, accurate and reliable, but it was designed to be hand-fitted by skilled armourers working at a leisurely peacetime pace. Modern warfare demanded weapons that could be mass-produced quickly by semi-skilled workers using machine tools. Garand recognized that the next war would be won by the nation that could arm its soldiers fastest with the most effective weapons. The rifle he envisioned would fire every time the operator pulled the trigger, without requiring manual cycling of a bolt between shots. This semi-automatic operation would triple the rate of fire compared to bolt-action designs. It would allow soldiers to maintain their shooting position and sight picture between rounds. Most importantly, it would shift the balance of firepower decisively toward the attacker. Garand's path to success was anything but straight. His first designs used primer actuation, where the force of the primer explosion cycled the action. This proved unreliable. He switched to gas operation, tapping propellant gases from the fired cartridge to power the mechanism. In 1929, his design won Army acceptance trials. Victory seemed certain. Then politics intervened. General Douglas MacArthur, Army Chief of Staff, insisted the rifle use the existing .30-06 Springfield cartridge rather than the newer .276 Pedersen round for which Garand had designed his rifle. MacArthur's reasoning was economic. The Army had millions of rounds of .30-06 ammunition in storage. Starting fresh with a new caliber would cost millions of dollars and delay deployment for years. Garand returned to his workshop and redesigned the entire rifle for the heavier, more powerful .30-06 cartridge. The process took 3 years. On August 3, 1933, his redesigned rifle was officially designated the United States Rifle, caliber .30, M1. On January 9, 1936, the Army adopted it as the new standard infantry weapon. The first production M1 Garand was successfully proof-fired, function-fired, and fired for accuracy on July 21, 1937. Production began that September at a rate of 10 rifles per day. By January 1940, Springfield Armory was producing 100 per day, but this was nowhere near enough for a nation watching Europe descend into war. On September 20, 1939, the same month Germany invaded Poland, Winchester Repeating Arms received a contract to manufacture M1 Garands. The company was less than enthusiastic. Winchester engineers thought the Garand was too complex, too expensive to produce. Relations between Winchester and Springfield Armory personnel became openly hostile, with each side accusing the other of incompetence. Despite the friction, both manufacturers ramped up production as war clouds gathered. By December 7, 1941, when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, American factories were producing rifles at unprecedented rates. The M1 Garand became a top priority overnight. January 1942 saw Springfield Armory producing 1,103 Garands per day. Production peaked in January 1944, when Springfield alone manufactured 122,000 rifles in a single month. This translated to 3,936 rifles per day, or 164 rifles per hour. Winchester added another 513,000 rifles between December 1940 and June 1945. By war's end in August 1945, over 4 million M1 Garands had been produced. The United States was the only major power to field a semi-automatic rifle as standard infantry equipment. Every other army, British, German, Soviet, Japanese, Italian, relied primarily on bolt-action designs. The tactical implications of this difference cannot be overstated. A rifleman with a bolt action must perform multiple steps between each shot. Pull the bolt handle up and back, ejecting the spent cartridge. Push the bolt forward, chambering a new round. Push the bolt handle down, locking it in place. Raise the rifle back to shooting position, reacquire the target, aim, fire. The entire cycle takes 4 to 6 seconds for a trained soldier, longer under combat stress. The M1 Garand eliminated most of these steps. Pull trigger, rifle fires. Gas pressure from the fired cartridge operates the mechanism automatically. Bolt opens, spent case ejects, new round chambers, bolt locks. Total time, 1/5 of a second. The shooter never moves his hands, never drops his aim, never loses his sight picture. Pull trigger again. Another round fires. The fire rate advantage was dramatic but not immediately obvious. A single shot from a Garand took the same time as a single shot from a bolt-action rifle. The difference appeared when firing multiple rounds. An M1 Garand could deliver 8 aimed shots in 20 seconds. A Lee Enfield needed 48 to 50 seconds for the same number. A German Kar 98K required almost a full minute. In the chaos of combat, this translated to overwhelming superiority. American infantry could put 3 times as many rounds downrange as their opponents in any given firefight. They could suppress enemy positions more effectively. They could break up counterattacks before they built momentum. They could win firefights through sheer volume of accurate fire. But the M1 Garand was not without limitations. The 8-round en-bloc clip system drew criticism from the moment of adoption. The rifle could not be easily topped off mid-magazine like bolt-action designs. Soldiers had to either fire all 8 rounds or manually eject a partially full clip, wasting ammunition. The distinctive metallic ping when an empty clip ejected became legendary, though whether enemy soldiers could actually hear it in combat remains debated. The rifle was also heavier than most bolt actions. Fully loaded with sling and bayonet, an M1 Garand weighed approximately 11 pounds. A British Lee Enfield weighed 8.7 pounds. Over the course of a 20-mile march, that 2.5-pound difference felt significant. Yet these drawbacks paled beside the weapon's advantages. The Garand was ruggedly built, able to function in conditions that disabled more finicky designs. It was accurate out to 500 yards. Its powerful .30-06 cartridge delivered decisive stopping power. Most importantly, it put devastating firepower in the hands of every infantryman, not just specialists. The British Army had evaluated the M1 Garand in 1939 as a possible replacement for the Lee Enfield No. 1 Mark III. By January 1940, Birmingham's Small Arms Company was already preparing production of the Lee Enfield No. 4. British planners decided against adopting the Garand. The official reason was that British manufacturing capacity was already committed to existing designs. Switching would cause delays Britain could not afford with German invasion threatening. There were other considerations, unstated but real. The Garand cost roughly $85 per unit in 1943, equivalent to $1,400 today. That was nearly double the cost of a bolt-action rifle. For a nation already stretched thin financially, the expense seemed prohibitive. Britain also faced ammunition concerns. The .30-06 Springfield cartridge was not interchangeable with the .303 British round. Adopting the Garand would require either manufacturing new ammunition or redesigning the rifle, both expensive propositions. So the British Army continued with the Lee Enfield, a weapon that in many ways represented the pinnacle of bolt-action design. The Lee Enfield held 10 rounds in its magazine compared to 5 in most other bolt actions. It could be loaded quickly with 5-round stripper clips. Most importantly, it featured the smoothest, fastest bolt action ever designed. The secret was the Lee bolt's rear locking lugs and short bolt throw. Unlike Mauser-style actions that locked at the front of the bolt, requiring a long handle throw and interrupting the shooter's sight picture, the Lee Enfield's bolt moved straight back only a few inches. Skilled riflemen could operate it without removing the rifle from their shoulder. British Army regulations required soldiers to demonstrate proficiency in the mad-minute drill. Starting with 1 round chambered and 4 in the magazine, a rifleman had 60 seconds to fire at a second-class figure target at 300 yards. The target was a 4-foot square with a 12-inch silhouette in the center. The rifleman had to reload from ammunition pouches, not pre-staged magazines. The minimum passing standard was 15 hits on target. 15 aimed shots in 60 seconds was respectable performance, but many British soldiers far exceeded this minimum. Competent riflemen regularly scored 20 to 30 hits. The best could exceed 35. Sergeant Major Jesse Wallingford set a documented record of 36 hits in 1908. Sergeant Instructor Frank Snoxell reportedly achieved 38 hits around 1914, though this remains disputed. These performances were extraordinary. They required thousands of hours of practice, perfect ammunition management, and iron discipline under pressure. The British Army of 1914 was perhaps the most professional in the world, with long service volunteers who drilled endlessly on marksmanship. At the Battle of Mons in August 1914, German soldiers reported facing machine guns, when in reality they faced British riflemen with Lee Enfields. Yet even these superhuman performances with the world's fastest bolt-action rifle barely matched what an average American soldier could achieve with an M1 Garand. The Garand's official aimed rate of fire was 24 rounds per minute. In practice, soldiers regularly exceeded this. 40 to 50 accurate shots per minute was achievable for trained riflemen at ranges under 300 yards. The mathematics painted a stark picture. 3 British riflemen with Lee Enfields, each firing 15 aimed rounds per minute, delivered 45 rounds per minute combined. 1 American with an M1 Garand delivered 40 rounds per minute on his own. 3 Lee Enfields versus 1 Garand was nearly a fair fight, and the American had advantages beyond raw fire rate. The Garand shooter never broke his firing position. His point of aim never wavered. He could track moving targets continuously while firing. The bolt-action rifleman, no matter how skilled, had to interrupt his sight picture with every shot. He had to muscle the bolt back and forth. He had to realign on target each time. These fractions of a second added up to critical disadvantages in combat. The first American units equipped entirely with M1 Garands arrived in the Pacific Theater in late 1941. The Philippine Department had received new rifles between August and November 1941. When Japanese forces invaded on December 8th, some American and Filipino units were armed with Garands, though most still carried Springfield bolt-action rifles. The initial combat reports were mixed. Some units had been issued 5-round stripper clips designed for the old Springfield rifles, instead of 8-round Garand clips. Confusion about proper maintenance led to malfunctions in the humid tropical environment. Soldiers complained about the rifle's weight during brutal jungle marches. But those who used the Garand correctly recognized its value immediately. In firefights, American forces armed with Garands could suppress Japanese attackers even when outnumbered. The sheer volume of fire made advancing through open ground suicidal. Japanese forces armed with bolt-action Arisaka rifles found themselves consistently outgunned. As production ramped up through 1942 and 1943, more units received Garands. By 1944, virtually every American infantry division carried M1 rifles as standard equipment. The weapon appeared in every theater of war, proving itself in every environment from Pacific jungles to European winters to North African deserts. The German military took notice. Captured intelligence documents from 1943 show Wehrmacht units specifically warning about American firepower superiority. German soldiers reported that American infantry squads put out more rifle fire than equivalent German units despite having fewer automatic weapons. The Garand's semi-automatic action gave every American rifleman capabilities that Germans reserved for specialists with their rare semi-automatic G43 rifles. In November 1942, American and British forces landed in North Africa as part of Operation Torch. Among the assault troops were British commandos specially equipped for joint operations with American forces. No. 1 Commando and No. 6 Commando received complete issues of American weapons, including M1 Garand rifles, Thompson submachine guns, and Browning automatic rifles. The commandos kept these weapons throughout the war. They preferred them to standard British infantry arms. The combination of firepower and reliability proved superior in combat. When No. 1 Commando deployed to Burma in late 1944 as part of 3rd Commando Brigade, they brought their American rifles with them. January 22, 1945. The commandos had spent weeks fighting in the Arakan Peninsula, conducting amphibious assaults to cut off Japanese withdrawal routes. They had seized Hill 170 near Kangor, a dominant height overlooking the main road to Rangoon. Holding this hill was critical. If it fell, all British forces on the peninsula would be endangered. The Japanese 54th Division recognized the threat. In the early morning hours of January 31st, the 2nd Battalion of the 154th Infantry Regiment launched a major counterattack. Artillery and machine gun fire pounded the northern end of Hill 170, where Lieutenant George Nolan's No. 4 Troop held the line. At 0730, Japanese infantry attacked in platoon-sized waves, hurling grenades and charging with fixed bayonets. Nolan's platoon of 24 men faced approximately 300 attackers. The odds were horrific, but every British soldier held an M1 Garand. The difference was immediately apparent. Japanese soldiers armed with bolt-action, Type 99 rifles could not match the sustained fire from the commando's semi-automatic weapons. Each British rifleman could maintain continuous fire without the vulnerable pauses required for working a bolt. The attackers were cut down before they could close to hand grenade range. Lieutenant Colonel Trevor, who commanded No. 1 Commando, would later write in his memoir that the unit's combination of Garand rifles, Thompson submachine guns, and Bren light machine guns gave them a clear firepower advantage over Japanese forces. The Garands were particularly valuable because they gave every rifleman automatic weapon firepower without the ammunition consumption of true machine guns. The battle raged for 12 hours. Wave after wave of Japanese infantry crashed against the British positions. Lieutenant Noland moved constantly among his men, distributing ammunition, manning machine guns when crew members fell, and firing his own Garand until he was killed in action. His leadership and the superior firepower of his platoon's weapons held the position against impossible odds. When the attacks finally ceased that evening, over 450 Japanese bodies lay scattered across the hillside. British casualties were severe but sustainable. No. 4 Troop had held. The firepower advantage had been decisive. For his actions, Lieutenant Noland received a posthumous Victoria Cross. No. 1 Commando's defense of Hill 170 became a legendary engagement, studied for decades afterward, as an example of how superior weapons technology could offset numerical disadvantage. The Battle of Hill 170 demonstrated in microcosm what American forces experienced across all theatres. The M1 Garand gave infantry units a fundamental tactical advantage. They could win firefights through superior volume of fire. They could break up enemy attacks before they gained momentum. They could hold defensive positions against larger forces. General George Patton, commanding Third Army in Europe during 1944 and 1945, wrote to the Ordnance Department on January 26, 1945. In my opinion, the M1 rifle is the greatest battle implement ever devised. Coming from Patton, a notoriously critical commander who rarely praised anything, this was extraordinary recognition. Patton understood what the Garand meant tactically. His army could advance aggressively because his infantry could win firefights reliably. When German forces counterattacked, American defensive fire shredded them. The semi-automatic rifle transformed American infantry from merely adequate to genuinely superior. The production achievement was equally impressive. Between 1937 and 1945, Springfield Armory manufactured 3,526,922 M1 Garands. Winchester added 513,880. Combined production exceeded 4 million rifles by war's end. The factories operated 24 hours a day in 3 shifts. By mid-1943, Springfield's output topped 4,000 rifles daily. This was accomplished despite wartime shortages of skilled labor, with women and older men replacing drafted workers. The rifles met stringent quality standards. Acceptance testing required each rifle to group within 4 inches at 100 yards. The logistics of supplying 4 million rifles boggle the mind. Each Garand contained 54 major components and hundreds of smaller parts. Every component had to meet precise tolerances. Barrels were carefully inspected for straightness and bore dimensions. Gas systems were tested under pressure. Receivers were stress-tested to ensure they would not crack under sustained use. The supply chain extended across America. Steel came from mills in Pennsylvania and Ohio. Wood stocks were cut from walnut trees in California, Missouri, and the Appalachian Mountains. Machine tools were manufactured in Connecticut and Massachusetts. Springs came from specialized factories in Indiana. The web of suppliers employed tens of thousands of workers who never assembled a complete rifle but contributed essential components. This massive industrial effort represented America's fundamental strategic advantage. The nation's manufacturing capacity, protected by two oceans from enemy bombing, could produce weapons faster than enemies could destroy them. Where Germany struggled to equip every soldier with adequate small arms, America fielded the most advanced infantry rifle in the world as standard issue. The cost was substantial but manageable. At $85 per rifle in 1943, approximately $1,400 in today's money, the Garand was expensive. 4 million rifles cost $340 million. But this represented a tiny fraction of America's total war expenditure of $300 billion. The improved combat effectiveness justified the cost many times over. After the war, M1 Garands remained in service for another decade. When North Korea invaded South Korea in June 1950, rifle production resumed at Springfield Armory. Two additional contractors, International Harvester and Harrington and Richardson, manufactured Garands during the Korean War. Combined production from 1952 to 1957 added another 1,400,000 rifles. The Garand saw combat in Korea against Chinese and North Korean forces equipped with Soviet weapons. Chinese troops often carried PPS submachine guns, weapons with high rates of fire at close range. But the Garand's superior accuracy at medium ranges and more powerful cartridge gave American forces a crucial advantage. Operations research from Korea confirmed that most infantry combat occurred within 300 yards, where the Garand excelled. In 1957, the M14 rifle was officially adopted as the new standard. The M14 was essentially an improved Garand with select fire capability and a 20-round detachable box magazine. Production began in 1959, and the rifle gradually replaced the M1 Garand through the early 1960s. By 1965, the M1 was fully phased out of active service. It retained John Garand's basic gas operating system and rotating bolt. Even when the M14 gave way to the M16 in the 1960s, Garand's fundamental design principles lived on in American military firearms. International adoption of the Garand validated its effectiveness. Over 30 nations purchased or received American surplus rifles. South Korea, West Germany, Italy, Japan, Denmark, Greece, Turkey, Iran, and many others armed their militaries with Garands in the 1950s and 60s. Some remained in service into the 1980s. The rifle's longevity testified to its rugged reliability and effective design. British forces who used the Garand in combat universally preferred it to the Lee Enfield. The commandos who carried American rifles in North Africa and Burma maintained them decades after the war. At reunion events, veterans spoke about how the Garand's firepower saved lives. The weapon gave them confidence in combat that bolt-action rifles could not provide. The comparison between the M1 Garand and the Lee Enfield illuminates fundamental differences in military philosophy. Britain designed the Lee Enfield to be the best possible bolt-action rifle. Fast to operate, smooth in action, reliable, accurate, it represented the pinnacle of 19th-century small arms development. For its purpose, it was nearly perfect. America designed the M1 Garand to make the bolt action obsolete. Rather than perfecting existing technology, John Garand created something fundamentally new. His rifle embodied 20th century thinking. Let machines do work that previously required human muscle and coordination. The semi-automatic action transferred the burden of cycling the rifle from the soldier to the weapon itself. This philosophical difference extended beyond small arms to America's entire approach to warfare. Where European powers emphasized training and tradition, America emphasized technology and industrial capacity. Where others sought to maximize the effectiveness of individual soldiers through superior skills, America sought to multiply the effectiveness of average soldiers through superior equipment. The M1 Garand exemplified this approach. An adequately trained soldier with a Garand could outshoot an expertly trained soldier with a bolt-action rifle. The weapon's semi-automatic action compensated for differences in skill. A mediocre rifleman with a Garand was more effective than an excellent rifleman with a Lee Enfield. Technology trumped training. This was not to disparage British marksmanship, which remained excellent throughout the Sheeted War. But marksmanship alone could not overcome the fundamental advantage of firing 8 rounds without manual cycling versus firing 10 rounds with manual cycling between each shot. The physics and mechanics favoured the semi-automatic design so overwhelmingly that skill differentials became secondary. The firepower calculation was brutally simple. In any 60-second engagement, 3 British riflemen with Lee Enfields firing at the maximum sustainable rate of 15 aimed rounds per minute delivered 45 rounds on target. 1 American rifleman with an M1 Garand firing at 24 aimed rounds per minute, well below the weapon's maximum capability, delivered 40 rounds. 3 bolt-action rifles barely exceeded 1 semi-automatic rifle. But the comparison understates the Garand's advantage. The 3 British riflemen occupied 3 positions. They presented 3 targets to enemy return fire. They required 3 times as much food, water, ammunition, and supplies. The single American rifleman achieved nearly equivalent output while using 1/3 the personnel resources. In broader tactical terms, an American infantry squad of 12 men armed with 11 Garands and 1 Browning automatic rifle could deliver more sustained rifle fire than a British infantry section of 10 men armed with 9 Lee Enfields and 1 Bren gun. The Americans had 2 more soldiers, but their firepower advantage exceeded what 2 additional bolt-action riflemen would contribute. The impact on squad tactics was profound. American doctrine emphasized fire and movement. One element would suppress an enemy position with continuous fire, while another element maneuvered to flank it. The Garand made this possible. Soldiers could maintain sustained fire without pausing to reload as frequently. The suppressed enemy could not return effective fire while Americans maneuvered. British tactics with bolt-action rifles required more careful coordination. Soldiers had to deliberately stagger their reloading so someone was always ready to fire. The mad-minute training helped but did not eliminate the fundamental limitation. There were unavoidable gaps in fire output when multiple soldiers reloaded simultaneously. German forces faced similar limitations with their Kar-98K bolt-action rifles. Wehrmacht squad tactics centered on the MG-34 or MG-42 machine gun, with riflemen supporting the machine gun rather than providing primary firepower. This worked well defensively, but limited offensive flexibility. American squads could advance with every rifleman contributing meaningful fire. The Soviet Union fielded millions of semi-automatic rifles, including the SVT-40 and SKS, but these weapons never achieved the reliability and production volume of the Garand. Soviet infantry units mixed semi-automatic rifles with Mosin-Nagant bolt actions throughout the war. The Red Army never achieved the uniformity of equipment that characterized American forces. Japan attempted to develop semi-automatic rifles, but never got beyond the prototype stage. Japanese industry lacked the precision manufacturing capability and resources to produce complex weapons in large quantities. Japanese soldiers faced American firepower with bolt-action Arisaka rifles that held only 5 rounds. The disparity in combat effectiveness was enormous. The Garand's impact extended beyond World War II into subsequent conflicts and technological development. The basic operating system that John Garand perfected, a gas-operated semi-automatic with a rotating bolt, became the standard for military rifles worldwide. The Soviet AK-47, the American M16, the British SA-80, and countless other designs use variations of Garand's system. Modern military rifles fire fully automatic, but most combat shooting occurs in semi-automatic mode for accuracy. The fundamental principle of allowing the weapon's mechanism to cycle itself between shots rather than requiring manual operation traces directly to Garand's work in the 1920s and 30s. He revolutionized infantry combat more than any other firearms designer of the 20th century. John Garand himself never profited from his invention. He was a civil service employee earning $3,500 annually when he designed the rifle. He chose not to patent it separately, allowing the government to own the design outright. After World War II, Congress debated granting him a $100,000 reward. The legislation failed. Garand received various medals and honors, but no financial compensation commensurate with his contribution. He retired from Springfield Armory in 1953 at age 65, having spent 34 years refining and improving his rifle. He lived quietly in retirement until his death in 1974 at age 86. By then, over 5 million M1 Garands had been produced. His rifle had equipped American forces through 3 wars. His design principles informed every modern military rifle. The contrast with Britain's decision to retain the Lee Enfield illuminates different national circumstances and strategic calculations. Britain in 1940 faced immediate existential threat. German invasion was a real possibility. Every factory, every worker, every pound sterling had to contribute immediately to national survival. Adopting a new rifle would have disrupted production for months at exactly the wrong moment. Britain also faced global commitments that America did not. The British Empire spanned a quarter of the Earth's land surface. Forces were scattered across Africa, Asia, the Middle East, and the Pacific. Standardizing on a new rifle would require replacing weapons held by units on every continent. The logistics were daunting. Furthermore, Britain's industrial capacity was limited compared to America's. British factories were vulnerable to German bombing throughout the war. The boating, blitz destroyed factories, killed workers, and disrupted supply chains. Switching to a more complex, expensive rifle design would have strained manufacturing capacity beyond its limits. So Britain continued with the Lee Enfield and made it work through superior training and tactics. British infantry achieved remarkable effectiveness with supposedly inferior weapons because they mastered those weapons completely. The Mad Minute drill instilled weapon handling skills that partially offset the technological disadvantage. America faced no such constraints. Protected by vast oceans, American factories operated at full capacity without fear of bombing. The nation's enormous industrial base could absorb the cost of producing complex weapons. America could afford to equip every infantryman with a semi-automatic rifle because America could afford anything its industry could manufacture. This fundamental difference in strategic circumstances explains why America fielded technological advantages in many areas beyond small arms. American forces had more trucks, more radios, more artillery, more aircraft, more of everything because American industry could produce everything in abundance. The M1 Garand was just one example of how industrial capacity translated into military effectiveness. The rifle's legacy endures in museums, collections, and shooting ranges worldwide. Over 80 years after its introduction, M1 Garands remain popular among civilian shooters for their accuracy, reliability, and historical significance. The Civilian Marksmanship Program, a federally chartered organization, has sold hundreds of thousands of surplus Garands to American citizens. Collectors prize M1 Garands as pieces of history. A rifle gifted to Senator John F. Kennedy sold for $149,500 in 2015. John Garand's personal rifle, serial number 1 million, sold for $287,500 in 2018. Original wartime rifles in good condition command premium prices, reflecting their significance. The story of the M1 Garand ultimately represents the victory of innovation over tradition. Britain's Lee Enfield was the ultimate expression of bolt-action technology, refined over decades to near perfection. But perfecting old technology could not compete with creating new technology. The semi-automatic action was not incrementally better, it was fundamentally different. It changed the nature of infantry combat. John Garand understood this. He recognized that soldiers needed weapons that worked with them, not weapons that required constant skill to operate effectively. His rifle did the mechanical work of cycling between shots, freeing soldiers to focus on aiming and shooting. This seemingly simple innovation multiplied combat effectiveness dramatically. The mathematics remain stark and undeniable. 3 British riflemen with Lee Enfield rifles, firing at the highest trained rate of 15 aimed rounds per minute, delivered 45 rounds per minute combined. 1 American rifleman with an M1 Garand, firing at the conservative estimate of 24 aimed rounds per minute, delivered 24 rounds. But the American maintained his position, never interrupted his sight picture, and required no time for manual bolt cycling between shots. His effective fire was more consistent, more accurate, and more sustainable. In practical terms, the American soldier with a Garand functionally matched 2 soldiers with bolt-action rifles. Not quite 3-to-1, but closer than any other weapon comparison of World War II. The Garand gave America a firepower advantage measured in multiples, not percentages. That advantage translated directly into tactical success. American infantry could advance under fire because they could suppress defenders effectively. They could hold defensive positions with fewer men because each soldier contributed more firepower. They could break up enemy attacks through overwhelming fire volume. They could win firefights through technology when they could not win through superior numbers. General Patton's assessment was correct. The M1 Garand was indeed the greatest battle implement ever devised, not because it was perfect, but because it changed what was possible in infantry combat. It proved that technology could multiply effectiveness more than training ever could. It demonstrated that innovation beats refinement. It showed that the future belongs to those who create new solutions rather than perfecting old ones. The British Lee Enfield remained an excellent rifle throughout its service life. British soldiers used it effectively through World War II, Korea, and into the 1950s. It was reliable, accurate, and fast for a bolt-action design. But it was still a bolt-action design. No amount of training could close the gap between working a bolt manually and letting the rifle cycle itself. The American M1 Garand pointed toward the future of infantry weapons. Semi-automatic operation became standard. Within 2 decades, fully automatic rifles would become common. The days of bolt-action military rifles were ending, and John Garand's design hastened that end. The comparison between these 2 rifles encapsulates the American approach to warfare in the 20th century. Britain relied on professionalism, training, and tradition to maximize the effectiveness of its forces. America relied on technology, industry, and innovation to multiply the capabilities of average soldiers. Both approaches had merit. But in World War II, American industrial might and technological superiority proved decisive. 3 British soldiers with Lee Enfields could not quite match what 1 American with a Garand could deliver. That sentence contains the essence of why America's M1 Garand changed infantry combat forever. Not because British soldiers were inferior, they were among the finest in the world. Not because the Lee Enfield was poorly designed, it was the best bolt-action rifle ever made. But because semi-automatic operation was simply, undeniably superior. Technology had spoken. The future had arrived. And it wore American uniform and carried an M1 Garand,